Ready or Not is some of the most fun I've had in a co-op game in recent memory. It's a hardcore tactical shooter developed and now self-published by Void Interactive, and it also happens to be something of a spiritual sequel to the 16-year-old game SWAT 4.
Oh, my eyes!
It's challenging, it's crushing, and when played with a bunch of mates, it's also frequently entertaining.
Ow!
However, it's also in early access, which means it's incredibly glitchy, buggy, and about as unpredictable as a meth head, which, funnily enough, is something you're going to have to be dealing with in the game.
Come again.
Now, I actually got invited to check this thing out last year when the devs were trying to set up some kind of PvP event, and although I didn't actually play it, word was that that event was a complete disaster. Void Interactive, it seems, took development in a different direction and have since focused more on the PvE aspect, which seems to have definitely improved it, because even in this early state, you can really see that there's a whole lot of potential here.
Drop to your knees!
The premise is that you're playing as a SWAT officer, an unnamed, highly trained individual forced to deal with dangerous situations, like hostage rescues, raids, bomb defusals, and attending anime conventions. It's also a violent political fantasy and a dystopian SWAT sim, apparently, according to people who are paid to be offended by things. The same people, I think, who prefer 15-minute-long cinematics in their games and to be told exactly how to think and feel. And can I just say too there that I think a video game having the premise of being a dystopian SWAT sim is actually amazing.
He ain't lying.
Now look, I understand how the timing for a game like this isn't ideal considering the state of the world right now, but despite what mouth breathers masquerading as gaming journalists are going to lead you to think, there really is no political angle to any of this. And it actually, I think, has a very level-headed approach to its subject matter. This is a good thing. There's no bravado or theatrics, not giving each other high fives after taking down the bad guys, and it sure as hell ain't taking a stance on anything like that either. It doesn't tackle things on a global scale, it's confined to cordoned off areas in this fictional city. Doesn't matter if you're dealing with a human trafficking ring in the city docks or a hotel that's under siege, it handles each area the same, putting you smack bang in the middle of an incredibly hostile environment and tasking you with bringing order to chaos. You're arresting someone because they're walking around with an Uzi or a shotgun and putting other people's lives in jeopardy. That's it. And if you're not careful, innocent civilians are likely to get caught in the crossfire, which reduces your score significantly. So, if anything, it really treats this with a lot of gravitas, and you're penalised heavily for unlawful conduct. Even a couple of mistakes during a mission can end with a big old fat F.
Piss.
The likelihood you'll fail most of the time here, I think, removes any possibility this has of being a power fantasy, and that's fine, that's not what it's going for. So I think anyone who interprets this whole thing otherwise should really start putting on some makeup and a big red nose, because that makes you an utter fucking clown.
What the hell is that?
Now this is a tactical shooter, which means patience and a methodical approach takes priority over springing into rooms gung-ho. Is that gun-ho or gung-ho? Anyway, enemies die from a single bullet, but so does the player. And your so-called heavy armor may as well be made out of toilet paper, because that's about how effective it often is at stopping bullets. Ready or Not really emphasizes that lethality of gunfights, and it's kinda similar to playing old Rainbow Six games in a way, where you can often simply turn a corner and then the next thing you know, you're staring at that game over screen.
Man down, man down!
You can lean left or right, you can peek through doorways, and you won't hit the side of a barn unless you're aiming down the sights. And about all I think it's missing is a prone button, because I do think the option to hit the deck when bullets start firing would just be a godsend. But undoubtedly where this thing takes its most influence from is Irrational Games' SWAT 4. And if you're at all familiar with SWAT 4, well, you're gonna notice that a lot of the mechanics have almost been carried across verbatim. For starters, it has a very similar and intuitive contextual control scheme.
Prep a bang. Open and clear.
Aiming at a locked door, for instance, you can easily swap to your lockpick with the press of a button, or a battering ram, a breaching shotgun, or my personal favourite, the C2 charge. Yeah, the C2 charge, when you don't just want to open a door, but you also want to be able to substantially fuck up whatever happens to be standing on the other side of it. Aim at the bottom of a door and you can pull out your Opti Wand, the essential tool for any up-and-coming SWAT officer, peeking underneath to then survey the room ahead. And this thing is an absolute must, because as G.I. Joe would say, knowing is half the battle.
Pork chop sandwiches!
On the other hand, if you're carrying a door jamb, well, you can wedge one of these things under there to keep it locked down. Then aim at the center of a door to open it normally, aim at the edge to peek it, or the bottom to kick it.
Get on the ground now!
Is visible.
And it's a neat way of condensing essentially a dozen different gadgets and approaches into one easy to manage system. Just means you're not fumbling through your inventory trying to find the right tool.
Disarming trap!
Pressing T is going to again bring up a helmet cam for your buddies, which allows you to see what they're looking at. And if you're playing in single player mode, the system for giving out orders is almost identical, with orders able to be mapped to a button on the keyboard.
Blow that door.
Along with a more complex drop-down menu, which brings up a whole other list of commands. When you come across an NPC, you've got to shout at them to comply with the press of a button, something they'll either do instantly or instead do their best Forrest Gump impersonation and just hightail it out of the goddamn room. Then afterwards, they'll need to be restrained with cable ties, given a light slap over the back of the head if they're resisting. Aside from all manner of rifles, submachine guns, shotguns, and pistols, you can also still subdue suspects with pepper spray, flashbangs, and stinger grenades, along with a taser and a pepper ball gun. Again, all very similar mechanics and features to SWAT 4. Ready or Not though is a little bit more in depth here though, giving you a few more options to customize your weapons through adding suppressors, different sights, and grips. And I think the only issue that I have with this is that it doesn't actually tell you how this stuff is affecting a weapon's stats. I just kind of wish there was some kind of info screen giving you the pros and cons of like putting a suppressor on something, for instance. And off the back of that too, I do want to say that I like how the suppressors in this are way more true to life, in the way that they don't really suppress a weapon, at all. I think the biggest addition Ready or Not has though is the battering ram, and then the riot shield. The latter, I think, being one of the most useful items in the entire game. And if you don't have at least one person with this thing in their loadout, well, then you're gonna have a bad time. It's not entirely perfect, but I mean, if someone's crouching with a riot shield, they're often pretty much impervious to bullets. And then with the enemies focusing fire on them first and foremost, it's kinda easy to peek around the corner and take out the gunman while they're still distracted. The only downside is that once this thing takes a few bullets, well, then you can't see a damn thing out of it. But it is easily one of the most effective items in the game right now, and just another example, I think, as to why coordinated co-op play is superior to playing solo. Even still though, Ready or Not is a really challenging game, and a big part of that comes from how quickly and easily shit can hit the fan. Actually, you know what? That's a bit of an understatement. It's more like shit hitting a wind turbine. Honestly, I've lost count the amount of times we've been having this perfect run, only for things to just suddenly go tits up within seconds, and the whole thing to come to an end. One of the main hazards in the game are usually door traps, which is a tripwire on the edge of a door, which is often connected to a flashbang, worse than that, an explosive, and you would be surprised at how easy it is to just forget about these things. And it's always that one door you forget to check that ends up having a trap on it. One time I just forgot to look for it entirely, telling my mate the coast was clear, only for him to then knock the door down with a battering ram and get yeeted into spectator mode. Gotta say though, it was pretty funny to watch. It's one of those instances, I think, where you've got to consider that there is good jank and bad jank, right? And I personally think that Ready or Not is in the former. And I mean, look, it is early access, so you almost have to give it a pass in that regard, hopefully on the assumption too that it's gonna be fixed before full launch. But definitely one of the main takeaways for this video has to be that this is a game where failure is often going to feel totally out of your control. So if the premise of methodically checking every single door you come across for about 10 minutes only to then be dropped like a bag of dirt by a junkie armed with a pistol doesn't sound fun, well, then this ain't the game for you. Now, I'm not using that as an excuse for the game's current shortcomings, but I do think that the 2 or 3 times this thing goes absolutely bonkers is countered by the other 10 or so times when it all goes absolutely right.
Hands up, you get on the ground. Hands up now. Drop your knees.
Those times when you can successfully clear a room with your buddies and everything all comes together is when the whole thing truly shines. And it's something that just can't get replicated when you're playing solo.
Drop it now.
The Rainbow Six series has kind of become a ghost of its former self, and a game like this reminds me just how much fun that genre used to be, before Siege got into the current state that it's in, with operators that feel more like something out of a hero shooter. Now, regards to the mission you've chosen, the ultimate goal is really to get in there and restrain everyone. If they're a suspect and they resist, well, then you've got the option to drop them like a bad habit. As a rule of thumb, someone who's unarmed is usually a civilian, and then someone carrying a weapon is usually a suspect. But even still, though, you can't really afford to give an unarmed person the benefit of the doubt. You can order someone to drop their weapon, and there is a chance that they'll do that, but that's also pretty risky when you consider the likelihood that they're just going to open fire on you. Sometimes too, even after surrendering, these assholes will pull out another gun and keep shooting. The alternative is subduing them with non-lethal options, shooting someone with the pepper ball gun, some pepper spray, lighting them up with a taser, or pulling out the old beanbag shotgun are all viable methods.
Hands up!
The gun's down, I don't have any more.
So either way, you'll be reporting a restrained suspect back to HQ or a dead one. And this is for every single NPC you come across, because only once this is done for every single one of them can the mission finally come to an end. So yeah, not a game for people who want to sprint from room to room and shoot from the hip.
You have the right to remain silent.
It doesn't take too long to get into the swing of things here. The only problem is that it is pretty light on content. In the current early access non-supporters build, you've got 5 locations in the game. There's a gas station, there's a docks warehouse, a car dealership, a crack house, and a hotel. There's different ways to play some of these, like you might have to rescue hostages, you might have to defuse bombs,
Please, get down!
or just take down a large number of suspects given more lenient rules of engagement. But the environment itself is the same regardless, and you're still moving through the same looking rooms and areas. The only difference comes from that RNG aspect, which always changes the locations of these NPCs. Ready or Not works okay with the AI in solo mode, but really the way the game feels like it's meant to be played is in co-op, with people on the mic who you can all coordinate with. And I say that because when playing with people who are willing to have supporting loadouts, it's really going to make or break the experience. If everyone's just going to take assault rifles and grenades and compete for who can get the most frags, well, then that's not going to end well.
No shit.
One thing that won't change though is the presentation. Now, Ready or Not runs on the Unreal Engine 4 because, of course it does, and it has been put to pretty good use here, with great looking environments and lots of subtle effects like reflections and lens flare. I don't know if it's been done as a homage either, but the mirrors in this game, much like SWAT 4, are also completely jacked up. And it's kind of a weird omission considering the abundance of so many other little subtle visual things they've managed to add in. The nighttime areas in this game are genuinely dark, and you really can't see shit if you're not using a flashlight or you've got a spare pair of night vision goggles with you. The goggles seem to have the right amount of realistic amplification, along with obscuring your field of vision to simulate having these giant things over your head. At one point when I took a bullet to the face while wearing a ballistic mask, instead of the bullet killing me, my character got realistically dazed from the impact for a couple of seconds. If an NPC is shot but not killed, they'll limp around instead of moving at full speed, and it's the small details like this, I think, which really help to add another layer of realism. At any point in time, you can bring up a little mini screen showing what your buddies are seeing, which is kind of helpful so you can have a better idea of what they're looking at, but it's also invaluable during a shootout because you can easily see where the threat's coming from. And it just really captures the feeling of watching this shaky, unedited body cam footage, even down to the way the camera shakes around when they're moving. Animations for all the weapons are super smooth, and I like the little mechanics, like being able to pull out a magazine from a weapon to get an idea of how much ammo is actually remaining. It skates that thin line between having a helpful heads-up display, but also not cluttering the whole thing down with dozens of different icons and needless information. The only issue I think is that the character models are a bit wonky with lots of weird clipping issues, and they almost kind of look out of place with Ready or Not's often photorealistic environments. I don't think this is something that's likely to be fixed all that much. I mean, it's just an inevitability when you've got that disconnect between these great looking environments and NPCs.
Suspect DOA.
Aside from the visuals, I think Ready or Not also has some pretty good sound work. Gun sounds, for instance, have a real sense of authenticity to the weapons they're based off. And aside from some cringy NPC dialogue here and there, the voice acting seems pretty organic.
Drop your weapon!
Banter from suspects and the in-game dialogue sounds believable without coming across as dramatized or needlessly emotional. Apparently real-life SWAT officers were consulted to make all this stuff as accurate as possible, and I feel like it really shows.
Contact in custody.
Same thing with the music, it's not dubstep or hard bass, it's nothing loud or overbearing, just kind of amplifies with the situation, getting louder during combat and almost serving as a cue to let you know if you're actually in combat. And then there's other subtle audio cues too that you may not have even noticed, but your brain did.
I can hear him.
Like shooting through a door, for instance, to hit someone on the other side, not only shows off how the bullet penetration works, but it also again highlights the sound work, often giving you this audio confirmation of the kill, as you'll often hear someone gurgling their own blood and slumping to the ground on the other side of it.
The suspect has expired.
But I do have to say that I did find the sound design kinda lacking when it comes to the directional side of things. Now, in case I haven't made it clear by now, I used to play a lot of Rainbow Six Siege, and I think anyone who's played that game is going to tell you that audio cues plays a huge part in it, to the point that you can often tell where someone is simply by the sound of their footsteps.
What?
And I kind of find that Ready or Not lacks that in a sense, like it doesn't always sound like audio is directional, and you're not really given enough information as to where someone's coming from. The enemy has a tendency to flank you, which is fine, but not always being able to have that audio cue to let you know they're coming from behind you is a bit of a pain in the ass, literally. But I do think most of the real faults you'll see here are the result of it still being in early access as opposed to just outright bad design decisions.
Great work, entry team. Keep it.
Just all comes back to that shooting and these random aimbotting enemies who suddenly go on a tear and wipe out your entire squad in the same time it takes a duck to fart. I'd say that clearing rooms works the way it's supposed to, maybe 70% of the time, and then that other 30%, you're going to see suspects who run around like they're playing Call of Duty Warzone. For instance, you, right, the player, physically can't sprint and fire your weapon at the same time, just for the sake of realism, I guess, but then that doesn't stop the enemies from being able to do that. At one point, some guy came running out of a room full tilt and managed to like wrist flick back and forth between 4 of us, gunning us all down within literally seconds. It's like we're all playing a tactical shooter and this guy's playing Quake 3. There's even a mod that's out there at the moment that attempts to fix this, but hopefully that's something they're gonna fix officially anyway. Enemies frequently shoot you through walls and there's almost nothing you can do when that happens, apart from just getting down on your knees and taking that big fat juicy L. I do also think that the length of some of these missions is also a bit of an issue. Like I said before, this is a pretty hardcore game and it is very realistic when it comes to the shooting, in the sense of if you get shot, you're going to be seriously injured, if not just outright killed. So once you're killed, and you will be killed, that's it. And if you're playing with your buddies, about all you can do at that point is just spectate from that point on. One of the missions in the game has you storming this large compound at night time, moving through these underground pitch black tunnels where enemies hide in wait and pop out to shoot at you like horror movie jump scares. Once you manage to make it to the surface and reach the compound itself, there's still so many bad guys to deal with. And there's so many windows and viewpoints they can hit you from that even if you're playing incredibly carefully, you just can't predict or even anticipate where they often might be coming from. I just kind of feel like it would be better if the player had the option to break these down into smaller maps. Like that crack house level, for instance, not only has the first house you've got to clear out, which is complex enough to begin with, but then also this series of tunnels behind it, and then another smaller house above that. Oh yeah, and if you shelled out the extra dough for that supporter edition, in which case, good for you, there's apparently another building that needs clearing out too. So that's essentially 3 different locations you have to clear in one go without making any mistakes and without the RNG gods taking a shit on you. Probably the most annoying thing is when you're having to comb back through the entire map to find that one civilian or suspect that you missed, and you can often spend another 5 or 10 minutes finding that one last NPC who's often hiding in a corner somewhere with his thumb up his ass.
Civilians standing by for trailers.
For the active shooter mission, I think is when it's at its worst, because once you've killed the gunman, you then just have to spend the rest of the time securing these civilians with no real threat remaining. That RNG aspect is great for replayability when it comes to mixing things up, but it's also kind of the downside to having these giant-ass maps. Every time you replay a mission, the position of everything changes up, so you're never really going to have that same experience twice.
They're here.
Now, my final main issue with Ready or Not is the lack of world building. Now, look again, I'm sorry to constantly compare this thing to SWAT 4, but in that game I do have to point out how each mission really felt like a self-contained little story. There was just an insane amount of world building in some of these for what was essentially just a hostage rescue or a raid. One of the most memorable missions has you arresting a guy who turns out to be a serial killer, and this dude's underground lair is covered in newspaper clippings, creepy paper mache sculptures, and even trophies and trinkets he's kept from his other kills. Upstairs you find his mother, who's an incredibly defensive, overbearing shut-in who is really protective of him, and it kinda starts to make sense how this 30-something-year-old guy might have gotten his screws loose.
You better leave my little boy alone.
Plus, the inclusion of a security system in this underground network he set up also speaks volumes about his paranoia, and this is all in a mission you're likely to beat in less than 10 minutes. Even the small things, like during one mission where there's a diamond heist, as you move through the lobby of the building, there's a crashed armored truck that's come through the front door, so right away you instantly know how these guys attack the place. Or how about just some basic physics with props and objects in the game world? I mean, how is this running on a modern engine, for instance, and yet I can't even shoot the balls around a pool table? I just found that outside of shooting through doors, there's not really any kind of destruction to the environment. Now look, these are minor elements which don't really affect the player overall. I mean, your mission's more or less the same, but it just adds that aspect of believability and makes the environment seem much more real. Ready or Not's environments are hotels, gas stations, and a crack house, and yeah, they do look great, but it just feels like the environment was built and then populated with random NPCs. I just never got the gist of these characters being connected to these locations in the same way. I think the only thing I've seen in the game that shows what I'm talking about is during that mission in the crack house, there's a young girl on a bed who appears to be having a seizure. I mean, yeah, it's just a single NPC, but now it sets this entire house up as this horrible place of despair, you know what I mean? Where lives are being ruined now in more ways than one. I know this is nitpicking of the highest order, but I just think these are the kind of small details that make the difference in something feeling memorable and realistic, as opposed to environments and missions that could really be taken out of any other tactical shooter. There's a reason why people are still talking about that one serial killer mission in SWAT 4, for instance, almost 17 years later. And I think anyone who's played it's also going to remember the mission later on in the basement of that cultist building.
Oh, my eyes!
It is early days though, and the long and short of it is that all of what I've said in this video might be redundant by the time most people watch it. In fact, I kind of hope that's the case. Overall, I'm just astounded at how much fun this thing is, and how far it's progressed from what I'd heard described as a train wreck barely 12 months ago. The biggest deterrent this thing has right now, I think, is definitely its price. I think the $50 price tag is justified if you plan on sticking with it through development, but the $150 they're charging for that supporter edition just seems insane.
Collecting evidence.
I know a pretty big patch is planned sometime later this month, which is hopefully going to address some of the things I had problems with, but as far as I understand it, those changes are first given to the supporter edition and then rolled out later for these early access builds, and I just have no idea when that's supposed to come into effect. I think what's really going to make or break this game though in the coming months is how they continue to handle all this controversy. I think they're supposed to be adding in a mission set around a school shooting, and I think regardless of how they handle this, it's just going to cause controversy. The long and short of it is that school shootings are a horrible, dreadful occurrence, but they are an occurrence, and that is relevant within the context of Ready or Not's setting and realism. As long as they approach this from a realistic standpoint as opposed to an exploitive one, well, I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And for all these people who think that something like that is disrespectful, well, I've got a word of advice. You should probably stay away from the likes of other games like Call of Duty, Battlefield, and anything else that focuses on real-life conflicts. I mean, some of those games treat warfare, not to mention history's most infamous wars, like they're big dumb action films. So to wrap the whole thing up, look, if you've got a bunch of mates to play this thing with, well, then I can easily recommend Ready or Not. It's a long way off being finished and far from a masterpiece, but those brief glimpses you get when the whole thing comes together, combined with a constant challenge of getting a better rank for each mission, is an addictive cycle I've just found hard to break out of. And really, do you know what? If Kotaku hates it, it has to be good.